Thanks, Leszek. That was completely unfair and uncalled for, but thank you very much for the generosity. This is an informal chat in a way, and I've been asked to cover quite a bit of ground in 20-25 minutes. So I've got lots of anecdotal things I wanted to say in terms of the original contact with the Arup Foundation, which I'll have to skip, and maybe in question time or over more politically correct South African wine, we can get back to that. So what I really want to just get into is a little bit, we've just turned 5 years old. We had an external evaluation commission this year on the African Centre for Cities, and it's all percolating in my head because as a team we spent 3 days a couple of months ago working our way through the findings of this external evaluation and thinking about the next decade. And in a way, what I'm sharing with you tonight is a little bit some of where we are in our thinking about what it is we're doing. We have to accept we're starting to grow up, and we have to make some decisions about certain priorities. As you will see, because of our strange identity, we on the one hand serve as an interdisciplinary platform to be a magnet at the University of Cape Town for urban scholars across all faculties and departments. But on the other hand, we're also very engaged with practice. And we're really interested to understand how does a university-based research center figure out how to intervene in the messy, complex, institutional environment of African urban development in the African urban development sector across the world. And hopefully, as I go through this, you will see what this adventure is all about, right? So we haven't resolved many things, but we try to be absolutely conscious that this is an experiment. And as an experiment, we have to remain a little bit on the wild side, but be reflective and try and always understand whether this is the best way of moving things forward. So I'm going to very briefly contextualize the work. Obviously, the critical frame is the dramatic urban transition that Africa is, and the rest of the global south, particularly Asia, is going through. And that's throwing up a number of really tough pressures. And I want to talk a little bit about how we think about that. And then say a few things about the institution itself, kind of how we define ourselves in the world, if we have to ascribe an identity, and what are the various dimensions that we're trying to balance in terms of both our institutional identity and evolution, but also the research agenda and the relationship with our teaching practice. And then I want to conclude with some propositions, because I don't want to create the idea or the impression that in the face of the complexity and the severity of the challenges that the urban transition represents, is that we're simply in the mode of analysis and critique. We're absolutely interested and committed to the idea of proposition, but proposition that is theoretically informed and that is really rooted in, if you will, spaces of co-production where we allow practitioners and scholars to come together and talk through what it is to apply or to work with certain concepts in the realm of practice. And hopefully that will give you enough of a flavor of what the size and the shape and the dynamism of this beast is. So of course everybody is very familiar with this, that Africa and Asia's urban transition is at a different pace than the rest of the world. But that within that, there's probably two really important things to consider if we look over the next 2 generations between now and 2050. The one is the fact that we're expecting the number of people who live informally or in slum conditions to treble to about 3 billion. But the last 2 bars, I think, is much more important and significant. And I want to suggest to you that the growth of the middle class and the tension in terms of how we think about the growth of the middle class and how that is absolutely driving the obsessions of particularly multinational corporations in the global capitalist system and shaping the built environment and priority decisions and so on, and understand the tension between coming to terms with the reality of slum urbanism and a large proportion of the global population living in slum conditions. At the same time, this tantalizing opportunity of new markets that is emerging that is something like tenfold greater to what the OECD middle class is going to look like by 2050. And that particular tension really sits at the heart of some of the conflicting interests in terms of both certain policy agendas that is emerging and the real politic about how urban resources are allocated. Now, again, this background most of you would know, but again, it's one of those things one has to kind of return to because the magnitude of the scale of the transition we're right in the midst of is so overwhelming that it's something that one pushes to one's subconscious. So if we remind ourselves that this urban story is recent, that in the global north, the urban transition took about 200 years to reach the tipping point of 50% between 1750 and 1950, that same transition in the global south is happening in 80 years, right? And the magnitude of that is of a completely different order. So we're talking about a transition from about 350 million people urban in 1950 in the global south to 3.9 billion people expected in the global south to be urbanized. And of course, this transition has to be managed in a context where we also have to figure out how to transition to a low carbon economy in terms of the Kyoto parameters that has been decided upon. So not only do you have to attend to 3 billion people living informally, living well below the income poverty line, the massive need for infrastructure provision, you also have to factor in that the basis of that, the economic drivers of that, cannot be what it has been over the industrial period. And frankly, within the academy, within the way that urban knowledge has been constructed and how urban professionals have been trained, nobody's geared for this. Nobody's been trained to understand what that means, either in terms of how one gears expertise, finances, or governance institutions. And it is into that vacuum that we have to come to terms with the fact that what I call slum urbanism is in fact the dominant condition in the African context. So a few things about sub-Saharan Africa, because again, of course, it's our primary reference point. We define ourselves in relation to the global south, but we do appreciate that the severity and the scale of the challenges in sub-Saharan Africa is of such a magnitude that that has to be our priority. What this slide very briefly shows over a 60-year period is just the rapidity of the urban transition in sub-Saharan Africa. So we currently around 40% urban, and that will grow to about 61, 62% over the next couple of years. Now, what some of you may not appreciate is that the distribution of this demographic transition is really uneven across the continent. So we're looking at dramatic growth in West Africa and East Africa, and a youthful population of something like 65% of the total demographic transition will be below the age of 18 by 2030. Now, this is, yeah, let me continue. This just reminds us of what that distribution is. So as you can see, North Africa has pretty much gone past that 50% tipping point, but East Africa is working off a very, very low base. Now, I like this slide, especially in the South African context, because of course South African cities and South African practitioners like to think of themselves as the bee's knees. And what this graph shows is that over the next 15 years, that the bulk of the growth of the largest cities in Africa is actually not going to be in Southern Africa. It's going to be in East and West Africa. And in fact, even despite all of the moral panics about migration and urban growth in South Africa, we've pretty much completed the urban transition. There's very little extra growth happening. It's really a question of consolidation. So the South African context is anomalous within the broader sub-Saharan environment. But more importantly, it cannot be a reference point for both theoretically or practically thinking about the urban question. So this, again, is just a reminder that in terms of the distribution of where most Africans live, it is not in the large cities, in fact. It is in much smaller cities. And if we're really going to understand what it means to gear a new generation of scholars and practitioners to deal with urban challenges, we've got to figure out how to get them to not just think about the Lagos and Kinshasas of the world, but to think about much smaller settlements where you've got hardly any tax base, hardly any form of local government, and of course, zero network infrastructures as a starting point. And what does it mean to begin to think about intervening in that context? But it's not just in terms of settlement that informality is the norm. Also, a recent report that McKinsey and Company has produced demonstrates that only 28% of people in the labor force are in any kind of stable employment. Only 28%, right? So again, all of the precepts that we have about how economies work, how tax bases get constructed, etc., simply doesn't apply. And we really need a fundamentally different paradigm for thinking about these conditions. So unsurprisingly, Sub-Saharan Africa has got a much greater proportion of people living informally comparative to Latin America and the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, but most importantly, the depth of the deprivation is, again, of a completely different magnitude. This graph just simply shows that on almost all of the metrics of basic services, unsurprisingly, you're looking at less than 40% of Sub-Saharan Africa's population having access to that. Now, if you look at the distortion effect that South Africa has in these numbers, it's a really shocking set of indicators. Now, the next two slides is based on a body of work that was done, and I spent quite a bit of time reading all of the private sector think tank reports like McKinsey and all of these people, Monitor and so forth, because they're telling an interesting story about the future of Africa. They're telling a very optimistic story and a very trying to kind of shift the pendulum away from Afro-pessimism to Afro-optimism, I suppose. But within that, there are a whole number of dangers lurking. Yes, the GDP growth that we've seen over the last decade is real, and it is likely to continue because of the particular positioning of most African economies in the global economy. But the distributional dimensions of that is cause for deep concern. So what this shows is that even by 2050, and this is based on the Party Center's futures model, which is one of the more accurate ones, in part because it's an open source model, and it's completely data-driven. If you look across the different regions, West and East Africa, we can anticipate that the people living below the $2 a day line, I think the $1 a day line is completely absurd, so I don't use it. So let's talk about $2 a day. That we're actually seeing, despite positive GDP growth over a sustained period in the resource-rich parts of the continent, a dramatic uptake of the number of people below that line. Now, this is serious, right? And so it is important not to get seduced by one version of that narrative and to understand in a slightly more grounded way what that means. This number is important because, again, it gives us some comparative perspective. It tracks expected GDP per capita numbers. And what you will see, and of course most of the regions in Africa is still below $1,000 per capita, that even projecting forward the three most populous regions of the continent, given the slide I showed you earlier about the nature of the demographic distribution, we're still talking by 2050 of a GDP per capita number of below $4,000. Right. Now, that just gives you a sense of proportion about what is possible in terms of investment, the role of the state, the kind of institutions you can expect, et cetera, et cetera. So again, as a reality check, in a context where you have rapid urbanization, where you've got pressures to structurally change the economy, to then look at that. And then, of course, one of the things that I really don't understand, to be honest, is how the Gini coefficient could already be equivalent to Latin America's, right? So if we think of it, Latin America's urban transition was 60 years ago, very different economic structure, it's industrialized, etc., and known to be one of the most unequal regions in the world, and already Africa is the same. And if you drill down to some of the urban Ginis, of course, it's much higher. So this is a really, really difficult statistic to contemplate. So if you then correlate these trends and general tendencies with institutional capacity to both understand and to respond, the prospects are pretty bleak. And so this transition, I would argue, unfolds in what one can call a policy vacuum, right? And there are many reasons for it, and I'll go through a few of those because I think it's important to have a grounded understanding about what some of the systemic drivers are of this condition. But predominantly, I think the problems are profoundly dysfunctional politics, skewed investment priorities, and of course, we know nothing about what is going on, and we are certainly not training urban professionals in a way that they can deal with this kind of context, right? And so if you add these things up, you're sitting pretty much with a recipe for the kind of systemic policy failure that we see. So if you're not ready to slash your wrists, just to kind of do a bit of a reality check and just kind of push that envelope a little bit further and see. So what we see is that we've got long-term under and malinvestment in urban infrastructures, and that little indicator there is telling that the proportion of GDP that goes into infrastructure is really low, and then what does get spent on completely the wrong things, okay? There's, of course, immense pressures to address these backlogs because of Africa's role. So if your transport and other logistics infrastructures aren't working, you can't feed the Chinese economy, right? So a lot of the pressure for this investment is coming from that. And there's a whole bunch of players now on the scene offering turnkey solutions. Now, of course, in a context with institutional malfunctioning, that's probably great. But of course, the problem is with a lot of these operators is that they operate within a very narrow set of parameters of what that turnkey solution is about. And the overall effect is that it worsens the dysfunctionality of the urban system at a regional scale. And almost all of the investment that is coming through, it's the tune of about 45 billion at the moment, the World Bank tells us, it is in that form. And with some really worrying consequences. So the net effect of these dynamics are we can see a pervasive Americanization of urban form, dramatic sprawl, ecological degradation, increasing spatial and social divides, and almost zero investment in slum areas, or what one can call effectively slum neglect. And this is really the dominant pattern at the moment. What one can characterize as extreme splintered urbanism. On the one hand, you have slum neglect, and on the other hand, you've got the emergence of these enclave elite urbanisms, right? So this is Nairobi. So on the left-hand side on your screen is Kibera, and on the right-hand side is an architectural representation of Gonzo City, which is a new high-tech enclave for basically foreign direct investment and for various international firms to be cocooned from the real city, effectively. Now, that's all well and good if it's private investment, but the problem with this kind of tendencies, and we see it in Kinshasa, in Lagos, in Addis, and so forth, is that it effectively elbows out the public envelope for structural infrastructure, network infrastructure investment to deal with slum urbanism. Because even though through public-private partnership arrangements they finance these things, the bulk connective infrastructure that's required effectively creates this dynamic. So this is, and again, very little critical debate, public debate about some of these trends, and it is pervasive. So some of the things that sits behind this is in political cultural terms, most of our leaders are still in deep denial about urbanization. Most of the regulations in terms of routine daily practice criminalize or victimize informality, whether it's in trading or in living arrangements. And of course, part of why there's such systemic problems is that our political institutions are wrapped up in the post-colonial legacy of dysfunctional identity politics in a context where multi-partyism has been introduced and opposition parties get a foothold in the cities, and it just creates this really complex, tough institutional settings. And then something that is unique to Africa, which is different to Asia and Latin America, is that the legacy of the post-colonial condition meant that most of the nation states' boundaries are so small, national economies aren't viable on their own. So if you look at your big, large-scale infrastructure investments, you essentially need regional arrangements. And you need to plan and organize and institutionally arrange them at that scale. But that's impossible because what's happened over the last 10, 15 years is that all of the investment deals with China and Turkey and Indonesia and so forth have been on a national basis. And effectively what that's done is it's locked Zambia or Namibia and so forth into particular deals that makes a regional agenda almost impossible. And so again, this is obviously from a structural governance point of view, making things really complex. And then just something that one has to recognize is that within this broader context of dysfunction, the people who pay the cost of this dysfunction are slum dwellers, right? Because the unit cost that they pay for any urban service is 10, 15, 20 times higher than the middle classes who are connected to bulk infrastructure. Now, I don't have an answer to this, but I think it's important to recognize that what, of course, sits behind it is that if you've got predominantly informal economies, what that means is that you've got predominantly households with irregular income. And if you have predominantly households with irregular income, you don't have a tax base. And if you don't have a tax base, it essentially means that the envelope available for investment is so small that these distorted political interests then capture that. And you kind of have this vicious circle where you have skewed allocation patterns and, of course, you don't solve the broader structural reasons for large-scale informality. Now, don't read the detail about this. The point that I want to make is that a report that the World Bank produced in 2010 that quantified the infrastructure backlog in Africa and what was required to deal with it basically suggested that because of the scale of urban poverty, 70% of households basically cannot afford basic services. So even if you put the infrastructure and even if you have the political will, you don't have a fiscal model to sustain that, right? And so again, I don't have answers for these questions, but why it's important that as African scholars and institutions is that we create a discourse that can begin to name these challenges and begin to theorize it and think through them in conjunction with practitioners, whether they be in social movements or public institutions or private bodies. So again, if you model some of these trends forward, we can anticipate echoing the urban dystopian analyst Mike Davis, that around 2030 we can expect a pretty serious confluence of a whole series of challenges, what we call the urban polycrisis: shortage of land, degradation of ecosystem services, etc. So against that backdrop, a little bit about ACC. So and just a small anecdotal thing about the name. We did, in fact, when Arup was part of the conversations to help seed the establishment of the African Center for Cities. It was initially called the Center for Cities in Africa. And the reason we changed it was precisely because we wanted to denote that there is no reason that we can't establish the center in the South and not have a global remit, right? So if you set up a Center for Cities in LSE, or you set it up at NYU, or you set it up at Columbia University, you don't call it the American Center for Cities. You call it an urban center, right? And so why, what would prevent us from doing the same? And so we changed the name to the Africa Center for Cities, and indeed, we do envisage that at some point we will have a research project in London. Why not, right? There's certainly a dramatic confluence of dynamics and drivers in the functioning and the dysfunctioning of cities that, that we are in the realm of that. So a little bit of conceit there. Why not? And so this is the little formal strapline we have, and this is what we do. And every word here is carefully chosen. So this notion of collaborative research, the idea of imaginative policy discourses, and a very clear values base is really something that we try and ensure animates our work. I'm not going to go through the detail of this, but really this stems from this conversation we're having internally at the moment, that we see in the face of these challenges and the absence of research and training to deal with it, our primary role is to be, over the next decade, is to create a network of institutions similar to ACC across the continent to begin to deal with these questions at scale. These won't be ACC satellites or anything like that, but we are trying to make sure that we can really begin to generate the infrastructure for this new generation of knowledge institution. So this is then how we kind of define our role and our work. So at one level, it's really about agenda setting from an academic position to say we think that there are alternatives, that we can espouse paradigm differences, that we're trying to understand how to build real-world policy models that can then be circulated as innovations. So we run a big lab, a lab program in Cape Town. We've got 8 labs at the moment, ranging from topics such as flooding in informal settlements to densification to urban ecologies, where we bring together over a 2.5 to 3 year period practitioners from the public bodies, the private sector, NGO, social movements, and academics. And they learn each other's languages and frameworks, and then they begin to agree on shared questions. And then they work through that over a 2 year period. And that's part of how we're creating a new contemporary archive on the city, but also beginning to try and experiment with an academic disposition that is not the traditional mode, because we don't think the medieval Baroque model of the university is appropriate for the contemporary condition. And then we, of course, do the academic training. We've got an MPhil program, which is where the relationship with Arup directly stems from, an MPhil in infrastructure design and management. We run a PhD seminar series, and then we convene various forums. And because ACC's recognition has now sort of grown, I suppose, we are able to convene various players. And so next year, March, we're bringing together the 7 largest urban donors with the key multilateral agencies dealing with capacity building around infrastructure investment to have this conversation about how do we create an institutional framework to grow another 10 to 12 institutions over the next decade. And that's one example, and we do a number of other things that I won't go into now. So this is the portfolio of work. We stratify it by scale. So UCT itself, our work in Cape Town, our work in Southern Africa. I'll highlight one piece of work there, which is on urban food security, which has been a fascinating body of work in 11 cities where we did a baseline survey in 2008, and we've been drilling down to understand the nutrition and the food component of urban poverty. And how do you build partnerships between movements of the poor, municipalities, and the various private actors, including supermarkets, in the food value chain to have a conversation about dealing with nutrition poverty in the city. And it's really, really been interesting. A new program is on the nexus between migration and informality and in relation to trade of food between Mozambique, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. In Africa, we number a number of programs. The largest one, and by far the most successful, is a network of planning schools of 50 schools in 18 sub-Saharan African countries. And the focus there has been curriculum renewal to respond to some of this context that I've mentioned to you. And then we slowly building relationships across the global south into Brazil, Colombia, India in particular, and Thailand for now. And again, our website has details on all of these. So to conclude then, a couple of more abstracted ideas, and maybe to give you a sense of what are the touch points when we're thinking about alternatives. And I'll go through 3 categories. The next slide is a very conceptual slide, and it is about the deep theoretical work that we think is required to create the foundation for better applied work. And then I'll show you a slide about the policy frame we're building and that we're testing at different scales. And then the final slide is really just to show you the methodology of co-production, and then I will stop. I know I'm going on a little bit long, so if you can bear with me for another 5 minutes, is that okay? So this is just a way of organizing trying to take the context that I've described for you into the realm of urban theory globally. So there's a big kind of angst moment in the field of urban studies about the relevance of urban theory and whether we talk about planetary urbanism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of, yeah, anyway, I won't comment about that. That's a discussion for another time. But what's interesting for us across these literatures, in the way that I've organized it, is this idea of Southern urbanism, which really just recognizes in the work of Ananya Roy that there's been this, of course, this dramatic demographic fact that cities are growing in the South. And of course, that as an empirical reference point has got to drive certain things. There's been a body of work for a while about the importance of understanding everyday practices as a form of theory building. And then there's a body of work about the fact that our anthropocentric approach to thinking about ontology, about the nature of materiality, has been problematic, and that we rather need to think in the Deleuzean sense of a vitalist connection between people, objects, and nature, and that in that way agency gets understood in a very different way, and one's understanding of institutions then also morph. Don't worry. And then there's, of course, the imperatives of network ecological urbanism, and I won't go into the detail of that. But what this does is, I can never get my vertical and horizontal right. At the vertical, yes, axis, that's a methodological axis, that it basically tries to suggest that empirical work is important, modeling is key, we need to understand data, we need to understand trends, but of course it gives us a surface reflection because all quantitative data is about patterns and about surfaces. At the same time, we need deep, intimate ethnographies about the minutiae of everyday life and practices as a way of fleshing out why it is to get traction and why the complexity is so difficult. The vertical axis, no, horizontal axis, you see, is really about politics. It's about understanding that there is so much to be done that we have to work in a mode of grounded pragmatism about dealing with the reality and the urgency of poverty and inequality and environmental degradation. But at the same time, if you add up all these trends that I've shown you, that there is such a deep, fundamental, if you will, existential inability to resolve the depth of that violence, that the only reserve we have is what Henri Lefebvre said, is to turn to the arts, right? Is to understand that aesthetics is the only way that we can begin to at least cope with the impossibility, the poetic impossibility of understanding how a world can function with so much injustice, right? And that's the other axis. And it's kind of, how do you move between a poetic sensibility to confront the reality of that injustice, but at the same time, think in a very pragmatic mode about what can you do differently tomorrow. And that's about a sensibility that has to inform the nature of the research and the training that we're doing. So that's enough about theory. This is the practical stuff. We think that there's 4 operating systems in cities that has to be radically rethought in a context of large-scale poverty and institutional dysfunctionality. The one is about social infrastructures and the other one's about regional network infrastructures. But that links very much to building inclusive economies and understanding that structural economic exclusion is at the heart of the urban crisis. And then, of course, to recognize that there's a fundamental spatiality. The use of land is fundamental to how these other things work. And of course, at the heart of that sits the question of governance. You can't get away from it. And so a lot of our work is really detailing elements of this. And this is kind of a broad canvas that we use to try and articulate a really heterodox set of research and teaching agendas. Moving on, I won't go into the detail of this. This is just some work on the economy stuff that I wanted to show, but I don't have time. Really just because the economic crisis is so fundamental to this, and how can one use the idea of social economies to rebuild livability in poor areas. But I'll skip this. So. And then finally, on the co-production side, or penultimately, these are the labs, and I don't want to say too much about this, but this has been a really low-key but absolutely profound cultural practice within the center to really figure out how as an academic do you step back from the arrogance of the academy and accept your limitations and begin to learn to appreciate and to value the depth and the, if you will, the incredible tenacity involved with practitioner knowledge and tacit knowledge. And it's something that, in a way, you've got to be in that process of patient, careful dialogue to really understand how profound this is. And I think that this has really been the one aspect that has, in a sense, set ACC apart from other research centers. And then finally, we're really committed to the idea that the kinds of things that I've been talking about, which is still incredibly abstract, incredibly specialized, that if we can't build new publics, new general, ordinary people's interest and commitment into these questions, we won't be able to achieve the change we have. So we've been experimenting with exhibitions. We had a large exhibition in Cape Town 2 years ago. We're planning a big one for the end of next year. So we're going to refract all of our research over the last 5 years into the format of an exhibition. We've got a portal called urbanafrica.net, which is an aggregator site for both news and policy and academic resources on urban issues in Africa. We've done these kind of hybrid academic journals, which really doesn't follow any academic rules in the sense of genre or discipline, but really opens up the world to the immense creativity and generative capacity of African intellectuals and artists. And then we've recently launched a magazine to build, again, a different discourse called Cityscapes around this emergent condition in the global south and to begin to build a set of publics. And then generally, we've been really trying to work hard at publishing and publishing high quality work because we're very, very aware of the fact that the global south represents only 3% of global academic output. 3%, right? And that is for a whole bunch of reasons, but unless one actually confronts that directly and begin to build alternatives to that political economy, we're in trouble. Thank you.